That's fabulous. If you haven't, please do. They're trying to migrate most of Realm. And then we're going to deal with getting guest access for those who are spread a little bit farther afield from where Park Street is actually located. Just a note in terms of a broader cultural calendar, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, starts this evening, runs through all of tomorrow. If you are aware of the activities on Yom Kippur, this is the most sober day in the Jewish year. And they fast. Basically, the term in Leviticus 16 is to afflict themselves. And so it's a day of turning to the Lord, a day of atonement. Perhaps if they'd been doing a little bit of that more frequently in the time leading up to Ezekiel's time, they wouldn't have been in the wretched state that they were at that point. At any rate, here's where Perry and I would like to head this semester, actually for these next 5 sessions. As I said a moment ago, it's essential to get a good sense of the historical context as well as the geographical contexts. They interface, of course, and they interface profoundly with theology. So we're going to get kind of a running jump on Ezekiel by going back quite a ways and spreading our geographical focus quite a ways as well. That'll be today, Lord willing, if the technology holds up. Next time, we want to move into some things that have to do with the kind of literature that Ezekiel is, particular focus on what this business called apocalyptic is. Interwoven through all of this, even though I've said theological emphases and it looks like a separate entity, to be sure it's really not, because everything we talk about today has a clear covenant basis to it. Land, the development of the history in terms of whether they are obedient to the covenant or not. But having said that, one of the things we're going to see is that profoundly important for Ezekiel, and we see it especially in these first chapters, is the glory of God, and then tragically the idolatry of God's rebellious people, which will lead them into exile. So we're going to see that. If we kind of can stay on track, we will make it through Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3 by October 25th, which is the date that we pause for Missions Emphasis Week. Even though that says 1 through 3, obviously there's going to be some things that will point forward and draw in important aspects in chapters 8 through 11 as well. So here's our starting point. And if you did your assignment for today, you've actually read this. But let's pause with it. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, I was with the exiles by the Kibar River. The heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. Now that's a direct quote. What's in brackets is a summary of the next 2 verses. This was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. Ezekiel was a member of the priestly family. As you look at those first 3 verses, hopefully some questions come to mind. By the way, please feel free to chime in, even though it's a bit awkward when we're sort of, and I'm not seeing you at all, back and forth on screens. But if you want to kind of unmute yourself and ask a question as we go along, I think we can happily interrupt one another. I've suggested some questions and issues that we need to address as we look even at these first 3 verses, and they're very much background. And not hearing any chimer inners, let's see what some of them have to do with. First of all, it doesn't mention Babylon here, but it does mention the river Kibar. And so we probably want to talk about that and try and figure out where it might be. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. And clearly, when we read the word exile, Babylon is very much in the backdrop for that because that's where they end up going. So we have to get that back in mind if we haven't been focusing on it. We need as well to look at the land again. We always have to focus on this promised land, the land that was in Genesis 12:7. The Lord told Avram, that he would give him the land, him and his descendants. With regard to Ezekiel, there's going to be a particular focus on the temple, Jerusalem and the temple. We cannot leave out the open heavens in terms of thinking about locations, because part of the issue that, and I'm not going to deal with it a lot today, it's going to be more focus in the next weeks, but part of the issue is if indeed God in his wonderful mercy chose to manifest his presence in the temple as his dwelling place, then how could that same glory be manifested in a foreign land? And that's going to be a question. So what are the open heavens doing? How is Ezekiel going to interface with that? So locations are important for us. The time frame is important. I said history, we got to at least take a run through the events that lead up to this horror of the exile. And then persons are significant. Ezekiel, obviously our prime character. Once we get into chapters 2 and then 3 especially, the Lord will address Ezekiel as Son of Man. We don't want to think of that in the same terms as Daniel's chapter 7, Son of Man. When Ezekiel is called Son of Man, it's with a sense of his being a human being, a representative human being who is indeed a servant of the Lord. More to say on that. Chapter 3, of course, will use the term watchman for his brothers. I want to say one more thing about Ezekiel's name, because it's really such an interesting name. Ezekiel in English is the rendition of Yechezkel. And if you look at those last 2 letters of the name, El, it's the shorter form of the divine name Elohim, God. And so the verbal root that underlies the first part of this name, Ezekiel, Yechezkel, means to strengthen or to seize, grasp. And what's fascinating about that, clearly God is strengthening Ezekiel for this very, very difficult task of prophesying. And we'll say much more about that as we go on. But there's a sense in which God grasps him too. I mentioned a moment ago that in some form that is difficult for us even to wrap our minds around, chapter 8 says, he was seized by the hair of his head and lifted in visions between heaven and earth, and he will go to see what's going on, the horrors in Jerusalem. So God grasps him as well as strengthens him. At any rate, he is of a priestly family, but he's in exile. More to say about that as well. We're going to look through the succession of last kings, but the one that's mentioned in this context had been actually on the throne in Jerusalem for a very, very brief time, 3 months, until he was exiled to Babylon. And we're going to unpack that and figure out how it goes. And then, of course, we must not leave out the person of the God of Israel and the glory of that God of Israel and that God who will call Ezekiel into the task that he has. So that's getting us started. Although I don't have any lessons listed, Lord willing, by the time we reach the end of our hour together, we're going to pause and perhaps share some things that may be worth taking home. So lessons is here as well. Well, with no further ado, let's head into this with a review of geography. This is something that I'm sure is familiar to you from looking at a variety of atlases over the years and projections of them, if this class is a successor for others for you. And you see a very small region of the land of Canaan, to which Abram was to go. And then, of course, as you look around it, we don't have any political entities marked on here or ethnic entities yet. That's coming in a moment, but you see this is a very small corridor between what we know to be Egypt and what we know to be Mesopotamia and what we know to be Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. Let's flesh some of that out in a moment. We have used repeatedly the term the land between. And it's obviously between international powers. So now we bring a little more definition. Egypt, always on the scene. Assyria, often on the scene in conflict with both Egypt and Babylon. And that's going to be really important a little bit later on, those two vying for power of that segment, increasingly large segment of Mesopotamia and beyond. And even in the years that we survey, Assyria is going to be overcome by Babylon. Now, in the meantime, we have, and it's smaller print, if you will, but Tyre, because Tyre is a representative city in terms of the whole Phoenician complex, and it's a empire. It's really probably better termed an emporium, and it's going to show up much later on in Ezekiel. In fact, if we continue to study Ezekiel together, I'm guessing we'll get to the emphasis on Tyre, chapters 26 through 28, along about next year sometime. Looking at those four names, you see a bunch of spidery black lines, and although there are some that are going across this Arabian desert, our main focus is what is going in between, in this land between these major powers. So that, of course, is where Israel is planted. Just a couple more things in terms of the importance of geographical background. Sorry, I'm trying to make the phone stop doing what it's doing. Can you hear that? I'll let Perry take this away. At any rate, it's a land between, not only in terms of geopolitics, but it's also a land between with regard to all of the things that make for agricultural fertility and economic productivity and all that. So if you look at this, obviously where you see Arabian desert and Syrian desert, that's pretty dry stuff. But the Fertile Crescent with the land of Canaan again in its southwest end is pretty important. Now, having had those visuals in our mind, let's draw together a couple of those things. And again, this is review, I realize that, but it's important review for us. It's the testing ground of faith. When you read the book of Deuteronomy, this is especially clear. It's not just any land, it becomes the testing ground of faith. We've already noticed with regard to the map that it's geopolitically vulnerable between those major powers. We saw with that Fertile Crescent map that is between the sea and the desert, and it's the southwestern end of the Fertile Crescent because it's entirely dependent on rainfall that sweeps in across the Mediterranean Sea. This is our link to history because, as I mentioned a moment ago, Genesis chapter 12, Abram is called to journey in faith to that land promised to his descendants, even though the end of chapter 15 makes it very clear, 15 of Genesis, that it's going to be a good 4 generations before they get there. When they are indeed redeemed from their slavery and bondage in Egypt, they are brought to Sinai. And the covenant has everything to do with relationship. And again, this is so important to understand, to review as backdrop for the book of Ezekiel, because it meant that they were to love the Lord their God without any interference from allegiance to other gods. Exploring a little further, here's Mount Sinai, and this set of phrases will be very significant for us, particularly since we've just been studying 1 Peter. And of course, Peter in chapter 2 is going to draw on these themes so much. But Exodus 19, verses 4, 5, and 6, and then Deuteronomy 7 as well. These people in this covenant union, in this relationship, were a treasured possession. A treasured possession. And of course, we need to pause on that. God loves them. They're chosen. And then, of course, they are to be set apart to the Lord. And these passages make that ever so clear as the foundation for what we need to look at. Moving on and fleshing out from a Deuteronomy 7 verses 3 and 4 perspective, again, they weren't to get trapped in the things that so easily entangled them, especially in the land of Canaan and the worship of Baal and some of those other gods. Mentioned it already. If they were obedient, the covenant articulated those things that are so focused on where that promised land was, rain and also security. But, and this moves us forward, if they were disobedient, as they were for centuries, Destruction was in the offing, and then finally exile. We certainly got a glimpse of this when we were studying Micah last year, but it obviously becomes even more painful as we move through prophets like Jeremiah and then finally Ezekiel as well. Well, here's the sweep through history. And again, I'm highlighting things that you know, going right from Mount Sinai, where we have the golden calf episode, right away. We could spend a lot of time on that. Through the entire period of the judges, after they got settled in the land, in Joshua, the apostasy of the people is just a downward spiral all the way. Even after the monarchy is established, Solomon, David's son, lands himself up in apostasy because he is building altars and places of worship for his foreign wives. After the split of the kingdom, the northern kingdom, it degenerates so quickly, even though the Lord in his mercy sends prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And of course, 2 Kings 17, in that summary of their disobedience, lists one after another of the kinds of idolatry and disobedience. Kings of the south aren't a whole lot better. We recognize the names of Ahaz and Manasseh. We have a good Hezekiah in between, but Ahaz and Manasseh are notable offenders in terms of their complete capitulation to the worship and idolatrous ways around them, particularly Manasseh and Assyria. And so a read through the entirety of 1st and 2nd Kings basically tells us that these people, just remember, this treasured possession, this holy nation, these beloved chosen people are awash with idolatry. Here is, in a graph form, all that stuff that I just swept through very quickly. I want you to take a quick look, particularly at Josiah. Following Manasseh, you'll remember that there is a reform, although we're going to say a little bit more about that in a moment under Josiah. And then there's just that tiny little rectangle that says Last Kings. And it's a sorry state of affairs. We'll review those in a moment as well. And then if you can read the fine print, deportation and exile, and then Ezekiel, who is in exile. Now, let's circle around to those final years. When you read the historical narrative along with the book of Jeremiah, it seems, sadly, that even though Josiah's reform was remarkable in terms of getting rid of idolatrous practices and so forth and so on, it happened in the 18th year of his reign. He lived, or should say, reigned 31 years. Actually, he lived 31 years, I'm pausing on that. And you got to ask yourself, what happened between that 18th year of his and then when he was killed in 31? We don't read anything more about reform movements. And when you read Jeremiah, it sounds like the people had been pretty hardwired in their disobedience. Interestingly enough, in 609, a very significant date to which we will return in a moment, Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, had been heading through the land between on one of those international routes that we saw on that map earlier. He was going north, and this is one of these strange bedfellow situations, because here's Egypt going north to basically be in alliance with Assyria. Keep in mind, those two had been kind of mortal enemies for quite some time. But you see, Babylon is a threat. And so we have a shifting of allegiances because Necho, Egypt, and the Assyrians were quite aware that Babylon was going to be a problem. So they go to Carchemish. We're going to look at a map in a moment just to pinpoint that. Josiah doesn't get that far in terms of going to Carchemish. He's just going out to try and intercede, or intercept, I should say, the Egyptian march northward, and he loses his life at that point. Taking over from him for a full 3 months is a son, Jehoahaz, and then Jehoiakim, another son, will reign for 11 years. It's in here that things start getting really interesting in terms of Ezekiel. Because in Jehoiakim's 4th year, Okay, if he starts reigning in 609, fourth year, 605, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Necho at Carchemish. So there's been some ongoing stuff back and forth. Necho seems to have been successful for a little while, but Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian steamroller are going to defeat Necho at Carchemish. Again, the map's coming in a minute, and sweep south, invade Judah. The year is 605. And just notice we have then two major battles at Carchemish, one in 609, which is going to begin to shift things quite radically in terms of superpowers in this area, and then 605. At that time, he will not only invade Judah, but he will take some of the royalty and nobility. Daniel is among those, by the way. So we read Daniel 1, verse 1. And then just a note in finer print, when you read Jeremiah, and particularly chapters 25 through 29, we're not going to be studying that, but just notice it's dated to the fourth year of Jehoiakim, and it's sobering stuff in terms of the destruction that Nebuchadnezzar would indeed bring about. Now, just to get our map in place, the green arrows are the Egyptians' sweep northward. And then, of course, we have the attempts to deal with that. And, excuse me, the gold arrows are, in this case, especially with regard to the 605 battle, Nebuchadnezzar's coming from the area of Babylonia. So 605 is a key time in terms of Jerusalem. Following that, 597, we have an actual attack on Jerusalem itself. And so, again, another map for our purposes. If you look at the red lines, this, as we put together 2 Kings 24, those verses that I've noted, along with some information on the Babylonian Chronicles, you kind of get a sense of what's going on. Now, I realize the print is a little bit fine, so I'm going to try and summarize for you what we get primarily from the 2 Kings 24 passage. At that point in time, Nebuchadnezzar will actually capture Jerusalem. Okay? He takes away temple vessels. This is a terrible, terrible affront, by the way, taking temple vessels. In addition, he will grab some members of the royalty. We're going to go back to that in a moment, but you'll remember the name Jehoiachin. Keep that in mind. Other leaders as well, and then at least an estimate of 10,000 captives. Excuse me, both Jehoiachin, again, not on the throne for very long, but also Ezekiel, one of the leaders, priestly leader, taken off to Babylon. And so even though our Ezekiel passage, chapter 1, started out with, in the 30th year, that's probably Ezekiel's 30th year, i.e. he has turned 30 years old, and as a priest, that would be when he would have been serving in the temple. And hold on to that for a moment. Notice as we read on verses 2 and 3, Ezekiel will date the actual things that are going on with regard to his own situation to the years of Jehoiachin. So we have the fourth and fifth year of Jehoiachin. Dates events in relation to this personal and national catastrophe of being taken away. And then you have a guy named Mattaniah, whose name is changed to Zedekiah. And he is Jehoiachin's uncle. He's installed as a puppet king, basically. He's under the thumb of the Babylonians. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar is basically going to lay siege to the city, and that will get us to our next time, except, sorry, interlude. I forgot this slide is in here at this point. Between 597 and the actual fall of the city, we do have Ezekiel prophesying from Babylon. So we want to take just a moment for that. It seems the Jewish settlements in Babylon were located in maybe a number of places, because the town or city or location of Tel Aviv is mentioned there, not in this passage, but in conjunction with the exiles. And so somewhere along some of the canals, no doubt. The word can mean canal as in addition to river itself. Somewhere in this general vicinity are Jewish settlements. Some folks have likened them to refugee camps. I'm not sure how far you want to push that parallel, but at least it's a suggestion that has been made. And this is where Ezekiel is. He seems to move from one group of people to another amongst these Jewish settlements, as we're going to see, which suggests that they are rather spread out. When you look at a variety of maps, there seems to be some differences of opinion in terms of exactly where this canal was located. That's why I've given you a rather large area there. I mentioned this already, but it is worth noting again. He's called this his 30th year. That's how the book starts out, 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile. And here, the next point is really important for us, just to pause with for a moment. Because you see, if indeed in the 5th year of Jehoiachin, so let's say 592, he's 30 years old, then he's been taken into exile in his 20s. This is a man who's grown up in a priestly family. His career was going to be officiating, amongst other priests, in the Jerusalem temple. And we can only begin to imagine the despair when he knows that that whole career is in shreds. It's terminated. There doesn't seem to be any possibility of going back there. But here's what's interesting. In these visions that we're going to begin to look at, he saw that temple. Now, of course, what he saw there was not particularly encouraging or pleasant, but he's going to see that temple, and he's going to see the threshold of the heavenly temple. Perry's going to get into that when we deal with chapter 1, and particularly reaching the end of that. I've expressed it as the threshold of the heavenly temple. That's probably a lame way to say it, but we had to fit it into some space here. Ezekiel sees the majesty and glory of God. He has to see that leave the Jerusalem temple because of the things that were so unsavory and blasphemous that were going on there. So even though his career that he had envisioned for himself was done, the career, if you will, that God had in mind for him was absolutely astonishing because he sees the ineffable realms of heaven itself. Well, just another note in terms of some historical kinds of things. It is of interest, I think, that Zedekiah, the follower on Jehoiachin, who reigned such a short time, Zedekiah, relatively early on, 4th year of his reign, does visit Babylon. We learn it from Jeremiah 51. The end of Jeremiah does review some historical details. And so, we don't have anybody knitting together those threads explicitly, but it is interesting that that is also the year in which Ezekiel received his prophetic call. And you can think about that how you want. It's kind of an interesting thought. Let's carry on a little bit. I began to go this direction a moment ago before I forgot to talk about Ezekiel and Babylon. But this final assault on Judah was brought about because Zedekiah took it upon himself to try to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar's pretty substantial control on him. It served him ill because Nebuchadnezzar came in Zedekiah's 9th year and besieged Jerusalem. Those red arrows are rather interesting because you see them coming down the usual track, which would be through the coastal plain. If you can see some of the finer print, you see Aphek there, major city on that coastal highway that goes through there. And then you see that there is a turn eastward by a couple of the red arrows, which, guess what, is one of the major access routes up into the hill country from that particular point. And we see sort of an encirclement of Jerusalem. Now, in the meantime, there's a pharaoh that comes up from Egypt. And so Nebuchadnezzar has to make a bit of a, side defensive measure down towards Egypt, so that when he makes his final approach on Jerusalem, it seems to be two-pronged. So not only do you have that area that we mentioned a moment ago, those red arrows that pretty much encircle Jerusalem, you will also have a sweep that's going past, and again, you need to look at the fine print there. Azekah, Maresha, Lachish, and then up into those hill country areas. So we see Hebron or Hebron, and then probably he will pinch them off together. By the way, just a note, kind of an aside at this point, even though we don't read a whole lot about it, Ezekiel later on, chapters 25 and 35, is also going to talk about Edom. Also going to talk about Edom. And we do then get the sense that not only is Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar pretty much squeezing the life out of little Judah, but from the southeast, Edom is coming up as well. And so God is using all these forces to bring judgment on his disobedient people. Well, let's finish that narrative a little bit and then go back and look at a little more history, geography, and background. Indeed, Zedekiah is captured. He's taken off. He has to watch his sons be slaughtered. Then he's blinded, taken off to exile into Babylon, and the temple at this point is burned. Hang on to those. And then one more line in terms or connection in terms of this Lachish business. This is a bit of a close-up on what we were looking at earlier. So just to remind ourselves, Jerusalem, Jerusalem was kind of a protected site in the hill country, off the beaten international track, which went through that Philistine plain area. We have studied before the importance of the foothills, also called the Shephelah. Just notice, again, pointing them out from the previous map, Lachish, major city, Azekah, major city, check the locations there, and then you have a red arrow pointing to Maresha. Connection with the Micah study, Micah was from Maresha Gath, and so this is his area to go back to that. But here's the point. Hold that view in your mind. Let's keep it there, and now we have some very interesting documentation of Nebuchadnezzar's assault through the Shephelah foothills defensive areas. First of all, one of them, bits of documents, comes from a potsherd that had writing on it. It's called an ostrakhan. These are the Lachish letters. They were discovered at Lachish, as a matter of fact. But the suggestion is this little indication may well have been written from Maresha. So hang on to that map that I just showed you. And I'm quoting only part of this, but it's the part we want to note. It's some kind of a commanding officer of the place, probably Maresha, who says, I wrote according to everything you sent me. In other words, the orders you gave me. We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish because we cannot see Azekah. They should have been able to. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but we know from other sources in antiquity that people communicated by lighting fires from high places. And here are the fire signals of Lachish. We're seeing them. We can't see Azekah. Use your imagination. This is a despairing, horrifying time. And here comes Jeremiah. Chapter 34, verse 7. The army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem. Remember our map with that little surrounding circle, the siege of Jerusalem? And the other cities of Judah that were still holding out. In other words, that sweep through the foothills where the fortified cities were. And notice Jeremiah specifically mentions Lachish and Azekah. These were the only fortified cities left in Judah. Perhaps I should have put that quote ahead of the letter, because it sounds like by the time the letter is written, they've lost sight of the fire signal of Azekah as well. Well, that puts Jerusalem in a very difficult place. A aerial photograph that no doubt we have seen before, that gold dome, now the Dome of the Rock, is on the site of where the Second Temple in Jesus' day and also probably Solomon's Temple stood. Just below that, you see kind of a spur sticking out. This would have been the city of David. To the right-hand side, that valley is the Kidron Valley. And between that yellow arrow and our red arrow, we would have had an area called the Ophel, kind of a raised area, not raised, but elevated from the actual city of David itself. Seems like the priestly families lived there. But the thing that I want to note here is not so much a history of the archaeology of the city of David, but where that red arrow is pointing is this. It's an excavation area called Area G. Lots more to say about that. For our purposes, I want you simply to note that as they were excavating this, and again, that little picture shows a lot of history. But notice where that arrow has just obliterated a person standing there. Underneath where that fence is and just down a little bit below was a house that had a very significant burn layer. And as a result of the burn, some things called bulai, saying more about that in a moment, were found, along with arrowheads. In other words, this is a severe destruction that is taking place. Severe destruction. And let's unpack it just a little bit. That house, there are other houses too, they have other sorts of labels, but that particular house is called House of the Bulai because what you have is a lump of clay, singular, bula. I was attached to a string binding a document stamped with a seal. In other words, when you wanted to send something or save something, archive it, and not want it tampered, you made sure that it wasn't tampered with by putting this little clump of clay on a string and putting your own personal seal on it. All right? Now, when the terrible fire, and the biblical text talks about burning the temple, when the terrible fire took place, it destroyed that house along with lots of others. Thick charred destruction layer, but it also fired the clay of these bulai, preserves them in great condition. And there's lots of Hebrew names. That's no surprise. If you've got a document that needs to be sealed and someone's personal seal is on it, it's kind of like putting our little return address stamp on something, right? At least two of these, and by the way, they're continuing to find this stuff in terms of these seals. So this is not the end of the story at all. But at least two of them belong to persons who are known from the Bible. And here is one of them, I think. Yes, here we go. Yes. In Jeremiah, got the reference there, chapter 36, we have a really interesting story, by the way. We accessed this off the web in case you're concerned about that. The top line, you read from right to left, says Gemariyahu. That's the Hebrew. We pronounce it Gemariah as we're reading this. But you may remember this narrative. Again, we're not studying Jeremiah, but Jeremiah is essential for backdrop for Ezekiel stuff. Jeremiah has been he's kind of off limits from the temple. So he has his scribe, Baruch, write down the words that the Lord has given him, and Baruch will go read it in the temple court. And he's heard. And when he's heard, he has to read in front of the king himself. And of course, what's interesting is this is the king, Jehoiakim, who actually chops off section by section and throws it into the fire pot to burn the word of the Lord. All that to say, you can go back and read Jeremiah 36. It's fascinating. But Gemariyahu, the son of Shaphan, is mentioned in that verse, verses 10 and 11. Top line is Gemariyahu, and then Shaphan is the second line. Isn't that interesting? Well, that's just a tiny thumbnail sketch of the residue that we should have, I should say, of the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple by the Babylonians at that point. Ezekiel has still been in exile all this time. And so now let's go back to what the Lord says through Ezekiel to the community who are in exile. No doubt, they are deeply concerned. These are leaders in one form or another of a community that has been shattered already in 605 and 597. They have their family members, their brothers or sisters, their covenant family, if you will, still in Jerusalem. No doubt they're concerned. So here are some of the Lord's words through Ezekiel, and they're not encouraging. Chapter 23. Bring a mob against them. Give them over to terror and plunder. The mob will stone them and cut them down with their swords. They will kill their sons and daughters and burn their houses with fire. Now, there's all kinds of things that we can make connections with in that, but we have to begin to get ourselves in the mindset of the last several months, maybe weeks, maybe days of this Babylonian onslaught against Jerusalem. And here the Lord is already speaking about this through Ezekiel. And this is what the audience in exile has to hear. Here, about the same time, you've got a quick note that Ezekiel's wife died. That too is a tragedy. And the Lord says to Ezekiel specifically, do not mourn. Because you see, along with all the other symbolic actions in which Ezekiel would engage, and we're going to look at those, some of them in an overview next week. Probably the epitome was that when his wife died, he was not to mourn. That too was a sign act, not mourning. And we have a connection with it. Chapter 24. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am about to desecrate my sanctuary. Pause for a moment. God was bound to his beloved, chosen people in covenant love. To signify that for them, he condescended to dwell in their midst, in that sanctuary. But the things have gotten so horrendous in terms of their breaking the covenant over and over and over and over again, as we've said in our historical review. God says, I'm going to destroy that marriage bond, that sign of the marriage bond with my people. I'm about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes, the object of your affection. Now, there's a lot we're going to deal with in the next couple of weeks with regard to what they were actually doing in that temple. But they had a sense in which that was their, well, it was their insurance policy. When you read Jeremiah 7, for example, you know, they did all these horrendous things, breaking the covenant over and over and over and over again, and then said, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord were just fine. Well, that wasn't going to be the case. And continuing on with this passage, the sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. And then later on in Ezekiel, we have a messenger who comes. And by the way, we're going to, if not today, talk about the various sections of this book, of which there are 4. But in Ezekiel chapter 33, towards the end of that chapter, a messenger does come, and the news is grim. The city has fallen. The city has fallen. Backing over, or going back over to 2 Kings 25, again, part of our whole reading sweep through the record of these last kings of Judah. After all this happens, after it describes how they burned and pillaged and so forth, the summary statement is, so Judah went into captivity away from her land. And of course, that is full of echoes and reverberations. The temple's destroyed. The land was the land of promise. They were in captivity, which is the end of a long series of disobedience and exile. That's where they are. Here's our map. And that single red arrow tells volumes. So our third wave will join already the Jewish settlements, or if you will, the Jewish refugee camps that are there. And of course, Jeremiah is going to say to them, when he writes to the folks in exile, he's going to say, because he's writing from Jerusalem, remember, he's going to say, you know, settle down there, have families there, because it's going to be a while, it's going to be 70 years. Well, let's pause for just a moment. And again, I'm not sure how well this is going to work since I can't see you. But if you'd like to unmute yourself and maybe take some minutes here to think about some things we take home from this, because as we began, one of the things I, well, mentioned in the prayer, if nothing else, was that, you know, Ezekiel lived in very challenging times. So do we. So there ought to be some things we can take home even from this. Let's see what we can mine it for. I'm going to be quiet for just a moment to see what you'd like to say.
And I guess, um, although it like we don't know God's will for 100%, right? Like I don't understand. Like sometimes I don't understand what's like how He's working, but then for a fact we know that He's still working, and we saw that in the Bible. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So He's still working, although it looks like we don't understand His will.
Good, thank you. And he's working in accordance with his covenant, isn't it? Which is really extremely reassuring when you stop to think about it. Because even the chastisement was designed to bring them back. Others.
Just occurred to me that with the pandemic, many of us are living in partial exile from our usual jobs and places that we visit, the ability to travel. Things are different than they used to be, and we don't know when there'll be an end to this.
Thank you. We're going to pursue that a little further in a moment. Thank you, that's excellent. Others.
Their disobedience. There is given over also issue.
I'm having a little trouble hearing the sound. Is anybody else, or is it just my system? By the way, I'm going to interrupt for a moment. This is reminding me of an issue we had last year. Have you all been able to hear me today?
Yes.
Or is it chattering in and out?
Yes, hearing you fine.
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay. Encouraging, because I know we had to install a microphone last year because things got a little bit sketchy.
I think the
Anyway,
person who
forgive
was
me.
trying to speak, I couldn't, when you said that you couldn't hear her, I couldn't hear her either. So I think it was on their end.
Well, we are obviously remarkably thankful for technology, but we also recognize the limitations thereof as well. So thank you. I'm sorry I missed the substance of what you said. Forgive me. Let me suggest, and by the way, several of these things that I've just added up here are things you're saying. And I suspect things you are thinking as well. And this does not mean to be an exhaustive list, but I want us always to be thinking of lessons that we can take home. And here's the first one, which was just articulated. Isn't it interesting how Ezekiel and the exiles that were already there were separate from everything they knew? And likewise, you know, we have confidently lived our lives in very secure settings. And our lives have been shaped by particular social, political, religious structures, and, you know, separation from those or having those overturned, having them be tumultuously upset in one way or another, depending on where we live. It's a troubling thing. And Ezekiel lived with that as well, and we can imagine the other exiles did too. So that's one thing to perhaps keep in mind. This is a hope in terms of application. when we do see these fabrics shred, you know, there are different ways to go, but hopefully instead of falling into despair, we go back to the fundamental truths that we know. It's fascinating that when God called prophets, he revealed himself to them. Now, in different ways, to be sure. And Ezekiel, in a foreign land, has this remarkable revelation in terms of the glory of God. The likeness of the appearance of the glory of God is how end of chapter 1 describes it. And even that is putting into words something that's ineffable. But going back to understanding God's character and the fact that God faithfully acts within the contexts of his covenant for his beloved, with his beloved people, drives us the right direction, I would say. This will be probably not so much a lesson that you might derive from today, but hopefully in the next 4 sessions, as we think particularly about, well, this destruction of God's temple, his sanctuary, as we think about his glory leaving it, and Ezekiel watches it go, being driven out by the disgusting nature of sin that the people have allowed to creep right into that temple. Hopefully we'll begin to have, in our moments, you know, it's hard to keep ourselves focused on glory and on holiness, but we need to have a renewed concern for that. And by the way, I'm speaking to myself. The we is very much part of, I need to be part of this as well. And then, you know, related to that, I don't mean this to sound too much like a modern day parable, but when we see how idolatry creeps into every aspect of the lives of Judahites, it really is a pernicious virus. It penetrates, it ruins, and again, that's probably a likeness that we can't push as far as we might like to. But sin is a pernicious virus, and it ruins, it ruins, it ruins, and therefore we do pray against it. I've got one more thing to do, although I want to be sure to hear any other comments that you might have first.
We also can't rely on foreign alliances to save us from geopolitical fear.
How very true. And by the way, as I said earlier on when we were talking about this strange bedfellow business, it's fascinating to see Assyria and Egypt allying themselves, in futility it turns out, against Babylon. Following up on that, when you read through the book of Jeremiah and other prophets at that point, there were some of God's people who were trying to continue to depend on Egypt against Babylon, you know, and those dependencies are just plain failures. So thank you, good point. Others? Well, with 2 minutes to go, let's see if we can get a structure for the book that will kind of be a jump start for thinking about it next week. Here's a general outline. And Ezekiel's wonderful this way, by the way. If we were to try and outline Jeremiah, we would tear our hair out. But with Ezekiel, it's pretty straightforward. It's discouraging because chapters 1 through 24 are a steady drumbeat on the end, the end, the end, the end. Doom is approaching for Jerusalem. Ezekiel will have different ways of saying it, God speaking through Ezekiel, and we're going to look at some of those next time. But chapters 1 through 24 do that. And you may remember that little verse that we read, Ezekiel's wife dies, he's not allowed to mourn for her, and that's symbolic in a huge way of the doom for the sanctuary in Jerusalem. Following that, there's a major shift. 25 through 32. Prophecies against foreign nations. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, Edom is going to show up in part of this. They don't get off scot-free. Tyre, probably next year, we'll be looking at what Ezekiel has to say about Tyre. But we need to keep in mind that Tyre isn't just some little dot on the map up there. It was a major emporium for all the Mediterranean Sea. And so, and of course, it had been the source of Baal worship in the whole Phoenician enterprise for a long time. Finishing this up rather quickly, we have chapters 33, which shift our attention back to Judah. But as we have those particular chapters that move that direction, talk about a new spirit, talk about dry bones in a valley and the restoration of those. There's still dangers that are there. But then finally, chapters 40 through 48. Now, this in itself is quite a challenge, but I'll just say this at this point. With Ezekiel's context of knowing the temple well, his understanding of God's presence was shaped by that context. And so as he sees a restored temple, a symbolic temple, the return of God's presence, that is going to be the heartening news for him and for his audience. Well, I've overstayed my welcome. My clock says it's 10:46. Let me take a moment just to close in prayer. I'll keep this on for just a moment after we pray, and then we'll leave the meeting after that. And you can get to the morning service however you plan to do it. Let's pray together. Our Father, how we need you. How we need to be so deeply aware of your holiness and our incredible place as your treasured possession. How we need to guard against the idolatries that so worm their way into our hearts. Help us to help those who are struggling with the sense of separation and alienation and difference and overturning of all the structures we're familiar with. Please make us vessels of your mercy and your love and your comfort. Thank you for hearing our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Let's stop the share. Ah, yes, Yom Kippur.
Great as always.
Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye, all.
Always.
Blessings to you. See you next week, and hopefully we'll have the technology rough edges a little bit better taken care of. So.